All right. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're just going to let folks continue to come in for another minute or so. We're wrapping up the FOIA training that was a little bit earlier. And so then we will start in just a minute.
Hey, Ada, quick question. I
Yes.
wonder if I need to, when we get to the Q&A at the end, I wonder if I need to stop share to see questions that folks have lobbed into the chat. I don't see them right now, but do you see them? Do you see like the chat function or?
Here, let me do you see this chat?
I don't, okay, gotcha.
But we can certainly stop sharing at that point and just allow it
Gotcha.
to open up a little bit as well.
That's probably what I'll do. I'll see that some questions are popping up, but then I'll just address them all,
Sounds good.
at the end.
We can actually address the question straight to you because it's been set up so that we can message you individually, or actually send it to everybody so everybody sees the questions. Would you suggest that, Ada?
We could do that.
Oh, gotcha. And I
That
can,
helps.
sorry, if I click on it, I can see while I'm talking. So what I'll probably do is, as a question pops up, I'll kind of look at it and see if it's something we need to address right then, or if it's something we can hold to the end. So this is great. I can see them right here.
Have we tested whether or not the screen advances? Okay, awesome.
We did test that one this time.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right.
Dr. Brannon seemed to have been able to fix it. That was great.
I know, she just has the magic touch. We've been having all sorts of PowerPoint issues this week, but hopefully it's not indicative of the rest of the year. Well, I'm going to continue to let folks in, but I also want to make sure we honor everyone's time by getting started. So I am going to go ahead and introduce the session briefly. This 55-minute workshop is designed to provide an overview of Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in educational programs and activities. Our facilitator is Mr. Josh Whitlock. Welcome, Josh. I've just lost my screen. There we go. Mr. Whitlock is a principal in the Charlotte, North Carolina office of Jackson Lewis, PC. He focuses his practice on meeting the legal needs of higher education institutions. He has extensive experience defending colleges and universities in a broad range of litigation and investigations, as well as counseling them on a variety of issues, including Title IX, FERPA, the Clery Act, and disability-related compliance, the handling of sexual misconduct allegations, and the student discipline in faculty tenure matters. Josh is particularly focused on delivering comprehensive, cutting-edge, practical, engaging, and cost-effective Title IX team training. He has conducted hundreds of Title IX trainings for a broad range of institutions and has helped dozens of schools design and enhance their annual Title IX team training programs. Today's session will provide an overview of Title IX's history, purposes, and requirements, succinctly summarize drastic recent and upcoming Title IX regulatory shifts, and provide practical tips and best practices for serving members of the community while ensuring compliance and risk mitigation. Our hope is that by ensuring compliance with these regulations, we can avoid having to call on him or anyone else to represent us in the future. So Josh, please feel free to go ahead and get started, and I will continue to monitor our waiting room if folks are joining late.
Will do. Ada, I just wanted to let you know, I'm seeing some waiting room notifications popping up. You're seeing them as well?
I am, and we're letting them in as they come.
Yeah,
Perfect.
no worries. I'm admitting people as well.
Awesome. I'll take that off my plate. Hey, thanks so much for the great introduction, Ada. I really appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all. I've been looking forward to this. It's a real privilege for me to present on this topic to you all specifically. And I'll tell you a few specific reasons why. One is the subject matter. I mean, I spend basically all of my time helping schools with Title IX related issues and some FERPA and disability, as Ada mentioned, but this subject matter has a place really near and dear to my heart. I mean, what we're talking about compliance, and we're talking about risk mitigation and doing the right things and all that. But what we're talking about at its base is people, right? And I like to make sure to never lose sight of that. We're talking about making sure that folks, regardless of sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, other things that we'll talk about, can get take full advantage of your wonderful educational programs and be safe and be comfortable in the environment. So the subject matter is near and dear to my heart. You all as an audience are especially, I really have been excited about talking with you because I have the great fortune of working with a really broad range of higher ed institutions. I do Title IX related work for over 100 institutions and from 4-year research institutions to small privates. I have a really special place in my heart for community colleges. I have the distinct privilege and opportunity to do a lot of training and a lot of work with community colleges, especially. And I really enjoy it because what I see is folks with the same requirements as schools with much more resources, trying to do a great job, but often with fewer resources. And you all have some unique, in the Title IX space, you have some unique challenges, right? Because your programs are unique, your offerings are unique. So I love this particular setting, working with community colleges on these issues. And I really think community colleges are the unsung hero and the driver of the higher ed system. So, and then the last reason is I'm a Virginia guy. I grew up in Abingdon, Virginia. I don't know if anyone might know where Abingdon is. It's way on the other end of the state. It's kind of almost in Tennessee. But I also went to law school at William and Mary and spent a lot of time in Hampton Roads. So it's great. It's great to be with a Hampton Roads area community college as well. So let's dive into this subject matter. That being said, and it's really, for all those reasons, it's my real sincere hope that I can say some things today that will be useful to you, that will be practical takeaways and streamline you being successful in your roles at the institution. So let me provide just a few quick caveats and then we'll dive into the subject. One is, there's a challenge with a session like this, which is very much geared to Title IX basics and fundamentals, in that I don't know how many folks we have on. I think Ada mentioned there could be 70 plus. I've got to expect that we have a really broad spectrum of experience with and exposure to Title IX. And I'll just say right up front that that's a little bit challenging in a session like this, because what usually happens is some of the things that I'm talking about are going to be brand new to some folks and totally first impression, and kind of old hat to other folks who may have had exposure in Title IX training. So know here that we're going to err on the side of being fundamental and a little more basic. I'm going to try, though, to strike the balance, and I'm going to tuck in for you all who are steeped in this and say, oh gosh, he's reviewing things that I've known for a long time. I'm going to tuck in a little bit more advanced stuff. And the way that I'm going to do that is by giving you kind of you all who have been in this and who have been watching regulatory movements, I'm going to give you a little bit meat on the bones of what we expect on the regulatory front soon. And that will be a little more nuanced and a little more complex, but most of it will be pretty basic, pretty fundamental, starting at the start with this. Another caveat is that this really is a basics session. And one thing to highlight there is that we're just scratching the surface. Know that if you're taking this session, if you're here, you're witnessing kind of the scratching of the surface that's going on around Title IX training and education at VPCC, right? So folks who are tasked with Title IX grievance procedure roles, investigators, Title IX coordinators, hearing officers, appeal officers, and the like, you all probably have already and certainly will be receiving much more in-depth training about your roles. In fact, the institution just linked up with us to purchase 15 plus hours of on-demand Title IX video training for your Title IX team. So that will be for the Title IX team. If you have a role in athletics, you can rest assured that we'll just barely scratch the surface today, just mention kind of your key requirements and obligations, but there will be much more in-depth discussions around that. So this is a session of general applicability and basic, kind of basic fundamentals, just to set the stage for that. So let's look, and let me mention this too. There's a chance that we'll finish a bit early today. And someone once told me that in education and religion, nobody ever wants their money's worth. What they mean is that everybody's always okay if we finish early and get a few minutes back. So I left some good time for Q&A and discussion at the end. Hope that we can all kind of learn from each other and participate there. But because I left a chunk of time, you know, if we finish with that early, we'll just give you a little bit of extra break before the next session. So how are we going to approach this today? What's the roadmap? So I'm going to kind of divide it into 3 sections for you. I'm going to start with basically a crash course of a few slides on Title IX's purpose, its scope, its enforcement, who and how is it enforced, its history, and its ongoing evolution. So that's a lot to bite off, but I'm going to kind of boil all of that down into a few slides as an intro. And then we want to talk about what are the primary institutional obligations under Title IX? What is VPCC required to do? And I've spent some significant time talking with your leadership and on your website and reviewing your policies and procedures and resources. So for folks who aren't familiar with those, I'll give you a little heads up as to where those are and what kind of resources are available to you. And I'll say something early on that front. You all, your website is tremendous. It's really, really well done. I have the chance to see a lot of schools, how they present information to their communities and to the public about Title IX compliance. And you all are at the high end for sure of kind of depth and thoroughness of what's available on your institutional website around this. So I'll unpack that a little bit. That's a really important piece. And then finally, and you know, all 3 of these are important, but maybe if I had to pick the key point and the most important message for today, I'll talk about primary individual employee obligations. And I won't hide the ball. The main obligation that we'll talk about there is reporting. If you all don't come away with anything else today, I want to make sure that you come away with a good sense of what needs to be reported and when. And I'm going to make it relatively simple for you all. I'm just going to give you some bright line rules about reporting. And then you'll see there that I'm going to tuck in there at the end of that, all of that kind of basic fundamental stuff. I'm going to give that little bit more in-depth discussion of the regulatory movement for those who are interested. So let's jump into this. And I think we said this earlier, but please feel free to lob questions into the chat. You know, I do hope that we'll have some questions and discussion at the end. I'll check the chat every so often as I go and see if there's anything that looks like, you know, maybe it'll derail us if we don't address it right away. But for the most part, I'll probably hold most of the questions for the end. So let's talk about, at the very basic, let's talk about the purpose and the scope of Title IX. And the purpose of Title IX is an ambitious and a worthy one. You know, the purpose is it's no modest purpose here, no modest goal from the Department of Education. Their purpose is through Title IX to eliminate discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs and activities which receive financial assistance, federal financial assistance. And on that last piece, receive federal financial assistance, just know that's all of your education program and activities, right? By extension. So basically to eliminate discrimination on the basis of sex in higher education. The next bullet, you'll see just a little bit more meat on the bones. This is like the actual Title IX prohibition and mandate. And it actually goes a little further than, I would say, just stamping out discrimination. You know, they want to make sure that no one's excluded from participation in or denied benefits or subjected to discrimination on the basis of sex in any of your education programs or activities. So let me make a point about these first 2 bullets just kind of conceptually for us. If I were training to the Title IX coordinator, if we were talking to the Title IX coordinator and the investigators and hearing officers, we would get much more nuanced about this, and we would drop down into the different types of sex discrimination and which types require which type of grievance procedure, and then even further into definitions. We're going to mostly stay away from that today, because the message that I want you all as a group to get as a broad group of kind of open to all employees and staff is the really broad scope of Title IX. That's the really important message for you all to get, so that you can understand the protections that it offers, but also going back to that reporting thing. I don't want you all, if you're not the Title IX coordinator, if you're not the investigators, I don't want you to put you all in a position where you're hung up on the nuance of, well, is this sexual harassment or sex discrimination, or is it sex-based harassment, or is it stalking, or is it, we don't want you hung up on that. We want you to understand broad application of broad prohibition on sex discrimination, which takes into it all of those other things. So that's a really important key point. And to continue with that broad application, let me go to these last two bullets. Not only is the mandate to not have discrimination on the basis of sex already broad, but then the definitions of sex and of discrimination are wide. They're wide and broad as well. So note that sex doesn't just include, and this has been a point of controversy over time, and this has been a point that's evolving over time. But as it stands today, based on what the courts have recently said, based on what the Department of Education has recently said, sex includes all of the things listed here. So there was a time when some folks might have seen sex discrimination and thought only of birth sex. And there was a time when that was there was a question in the law as to whether it went broader than that. Now that's very much been settled. So when we say discrimination on the basis of sex, we're also talking about all of these things: sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, right? And then discrimination, as I mentioned before, really takes within it a lot of things. You know, the kind of the basic discrimination is differential treatment, someone being treated differently or less well because of a protected characteristic, in this case, sex, or sex stereotypes, sex characteristics, pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity. But it goes beyond that too. Sexual harassment falls under sex discrimination. Sexual violence is a type of sexual harassment that also falls under this Title IX mandate. And under sexual violence, we have various other things, some of which are intuitive. You may know that you may intuit that sexual assault would be covered by Title IX, but the law has evolved such that it also covers domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. So this slide for me is just setting the tone that when we talk about Title IX, we're talking about a broad prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sex. And we're also talking about how the institution, how VPCC is expected to deal with these types of issues, these types of behaviors, what types of education you're expected to provide around it, what types of grievance procedures. That's all within the Title IX compliance kind of effort. Let's see if I missed anything here. Okay. So enforcement and importance. Title IX is enforced by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. If you work in this space or intersect with Title IX at VPCC, you'll hear of OCR. This is OCR, the Office for Civil Rights. OCR issues regulations and guidance, and we'll talk in a minute about how some of those regulations and guidance kind of impact all of us and where they're moving right now. But they also conduct complaint and compliance investigations, right? And so OCR is the agency that if someone from your community makes a complaint to the federal government about Title IX compliance or their treatment under Title IX at the institution, OCR will open an investigation, will contact Dr. Brannon, and we'll move from there to figure out whether you all are in compliance or not, or whether other actions need to be taken by OCR. And it's important to note that they hold the purse strings of federal funding. And here's what I mean by that. And not to be a fearmonger, but just to shoot straight with everyone, OCR has the ability to remove federal funding from an institution if they are not compliant with Title IX. Now, I don't want to be too scary about that. That's not something that has ever happened under OCR. And there are multiple steps to get there. Your institution would have to be out of compliance. And then basically when told that by OCR, kind of fail to come into compliance. So there would be some opportunity to fix it. But I just say that to highlight for all of us how seriously it's taken at the federal level, right? And how serious a thing it is for the institution. And that's why your Title IX coordinator and others are kind of watching like a hawk what OCR says about the institution's obligations, because we want to make sure that we're always meeting those. OCR is not the only kind of agency or entity that enforces Title IX. Certainly there's a private right of action under Title IX, and Title IX matters get before the courts. And because of that, and because of other variety of factors, this is a high stakes topic, right? This is a high stakes topic for the institution, right? You've got the enforcement concerns, you've got reputational concerns, certainly for how an institution handles sexual misconduct, handles sexual harassment, handles sex discrimination, potential liability to the institution. And then I said it before, but it's high stakes also because in every Title IX situation, every time that there's some allegation of discrimination, there are multiple people involved in that, right, whose lives are going to be impacted. So it's high stakes from that standpoint as well. And let me just tell you, in terms of that, you know, if you're not involved with Title IX compliance at VPCC, you may be wondering, well, how are we doing? You know, are we taking it as seriously as it needs to be taken? And I'm here to give you comfort on that. Again, you have really robust policies and procedures. You all have all the obligations, the institutional obligations I'll talk about. You all have checked those boxes. You know, you're doing proactive training like this that's not even necessarily required at this point. So VPCC is very much out front on this issue and continuing to be so. So the Title IX history and regulatory movement. I won't belabor this too much because I'm not sure how many folks will be interested in this, but there's a little bit of complexity in here for folks who this is relatively basic for. I'll talk a little bit about how this has moved. So in 1972, Title IX was enacted. That's when we first saw it. Think about, sometimes I stop and think about the fact that before 1972, discrimination on the basis of sex in higher education was not prohibited. There was no effort to address it or to eliminate it. That's a stark kind of reality. And that shows us the importance of Title IX coming into effect. And it's had great effect. And I'll tell you, for the first 25 years or so, now when you hear about Title IX in the news or otherwise, it's often about sexual harassment. For the first 25 years or so, up until 1997, not so. It was only really focused on, the Department of Education was only focused on gender equity in athletics, primarily. Primarily, that was their focus, and that's still a focus. And we'll talk more about that. But in 1997, they said, you know what? Not only should schools be equitable in how they roll out their athletics programs, but if schools aren't adopting certain grievance procedures to deal with discrimination and harassment, if they don't have a Title IX coordinator in place to deal with those things, if they're not telling folks how to report those things, then they're falling short. And by virtue of falling short, they're discriminating on the basis of sex. So in 1997, they said, let's start to give schools more guidance about what we expect from them with regard to those issues. And the Department of Education in 97, and again in 2001, and again in 2006, issued guidance around those topics. I'll tell you, though, it's interesting if you follow the change across time over this. In those years, they were issuing guidance, but they still weren't very much focusing on enforcement. So if you worked in higher ed pre-2011, it was excuse me. If you worked in higher ed pre-2011, it was kind of the Wild West. You know, some schools had grievance procedures, some didn't. Some just referred these things to law enforcement. Some dealt with them on campus. Some had Title IX coordinators, some didn't. It was very kind of all over the place and not very prescriptive from the Department of Education. Well, 2011 was a sea change. And for anyone working in this space, you know that. In 2011, the Department of Education said, we're going to now get really serious and hands-on about this. And they issued very prescriptive guidance around the types of grievance procedures you all need, the types of whether you need to have a hearing or not, you know, the types of investigations you need to do. So that was a moment when we all had to kind of jump and say, okay, we're going to have to pay more attention to this now, and rightfully so. The Obama Department of Education continued to issue guidance in 2014. They issued additional guidance. And then in 2017, the new administration came in and scrapped all of that. And so another thing for you all to know generally as background info about this is, not surprisingly, Title IX is a polarized issue politically in our country right now, right? So you've got, if you have a Democratic administration, you're going to see one type of focus, one type of scope, one type of enforcement activity. If you have a Republican administration, you're going to see a very different one. And that's what's been happening here. So the Trump administration scrapped everything the Obama administration had done. And in 2020, the Trump administration issued their new regulations. And here's a headline from those, which you may have heard of or maybe have been involved in. Those regulations require a live hearing for allegations of Title IX sexual harassment. So that was a massive change. Before that, you all hadn't had a requirement that you conduct a live hearing if you have an allegation of sexual harassment that gets to that point. Now you're working under that requirement. And so if you all were to look at your school's grievance procedures, you would see that they're great. They're really robust. I looked at them. They now incorporate a live hearing element for those types of things that make it down the road of that disciplinary process. The other thing, though, that the Trump administration did was they really significantly limited the definition of Title IX sexual harassment. So they said, we're going to require a live hearing for Title IX sexual harassment, but we're going to limit what we call Title IX sexual harassment and kind of the application of that. The Biden administration, not surprisingly, came in and said, you know what, we would like to scrap all of that and do something significantly new. And we're in that process now. So right now, we're still working under the Trump administration regulations. Your policies and procedures at your institution comply with that. The things I'm sharing today about reporting comply with that. But we know that changes are coming down the pipe. We know that likely in early to mid 2023, we'll get a new set of regulations from the Biden administration that will do multiple things, which I'll talk about further on when we get to the more advanced piece of this. But among those things is they will eliminate the live hearing requirement. So now going forward, after those regulations, schools aren't going to have live hearings on sexual harassment complaints. They can if they want, but they're not going to be required to. So that's just a little snippet of kind of how this is moving. A lot of shifts, a lot of things for your Title IX coordinator to watch, a lot of revamping of policies and procedures, as administrations change. And that's what also makes training kind of a continuous necessity, because this is shifting. This is not a static area by any stretch. So then what are the primary institutional obligations under Title IX? What does VPCC have to do to be compliant? And it's more nuanced than this, but again, we're doing a basic overview. These are the main obligations. You all are required to designate a Title IX coordinator. You all have done that. Not only do you all have a Title IX coordinator, but you have a Title IX and I believe multiple deputies, which is great because the Title IX coordinator is tasked with everything that we're talking about, essentially, right? The Title IX coordinator has a huge and important role at the institution. The Title IX coordinator is responsible for making sure that all policies and procedures are in compliance, making sure that all training has been done, and all the other requirements listed here, right? So it has to designate a Title IX coordinator. The buck kind of stops with that person with regard to Title IX. Have to publicly provide a notice of non-discrimination and other Title IX related information via the website. And here's where I'll give a shout out again. I'm going to shoot straight with you on something. Sometimes I do a training for an institution and I have to call out this point, and I have to point them to the institution's website on Title IX or webpage on Title IX. But I do so hesitantly because I've looked at the webpage and I've thought, oh gosh, it doesn't have a lot of the things that it should have. And the procedures don't look very strong. Not so here. You all have a great set of resources on your website on the Title IX page. You have the full policies and procedures. You have a really robust non-discrimination statement. Importantly for you all, for this audience, and I'll hit this again later, easy ways to report there. Just click report here and you can fill in some information and you can report. Information about anyone that you need to contact, Title IX coordinator information, deputy Title IX coordinator information about the training that's been provided to the team. So one of the things that I'll say later on to you all, but I'll say now just to highlight it twice, is get familiar with that, with the VPCC's Title IX webpage. It's strong, it's robust, it's got kind of everything you need. in one place there. The institution has to adopt grievance procedures for the resolution of Title IX sexual harassment and other forms of sex discrimination, and then has to designate and train a Title IX sexual harassment grievance team, right? And that's the 15 plus hours of training, which piles onto other training you all have already done that I mentioned, the video training for your Title IX team. But again, it's not that if an allegation of sexual harassment or sex discrimination comes to the Title IX coordinator, it's not like it might have been in 2006, or it might be some other institutions where, well, the Title IX coordinator will just deal with it case by case, the best he or she can. Here, there is a very set, if it's this type of activity, it goes under these grievance procedures. If it's another type of activity, it goes under another set. Those are spelled out, roles are defined. This has become extremely formalized. Just know that. You all, if you don't have a role in that, then you don't, you won't be involved in kind of using those grievance procedures, but know that they exist, know that they're on the website, know that it's robust. And one of the pieces that I think you can feel good about from that is it's become a little bit formal. It's become somewhat difficult for the institution to carry out Title IX procedures. There's a lot to think about, but it is robust. It is robust. There's no decisions being made on Title IX sexual harassment that haven't gone through multiple sets of considerations, very careful considerations under these procedures. So when you go to report, know that that's kind of what's waiting. It's not an ad hoc, case by case, informal approach. It's sophisticated at the institution. Feel good about that as you report. The institution's obligated to educate campus and community on Title IX reporting requirements. That's a piece of what we're doing here today. And then athletics is, I say this because I spoke with Dr. Hollins and others, and I know that you all are, and congratulations on this. I know that you all are have athletics offerings, and I understand that they're expanding, which is phenomenal. It's awesome. I work a lot with North Carolina community colleges, and I don't believe that any or many of them have that. So that's wonderful. Title IX in the athletic space is complex and is becoming more complex. I'll just again shoot you straight on that. It's very much the case. The baseline mandate, and there's a lot of nuance to this, but the baseline mandate is that in offering athletics opportunities, you have to offer this essentially the same, significantly the same level of opportunities, not the exact same, not like if you have women's field hockey, you must have men's field hockey, but the same level of offerings to males and females, right? And so within that, there are multiple tests that OCR applies to ensure that you're making offerings, commensurate offerings. They sometimes look at down to locker rooms and resources and buses. They get far into the weeds sometimes if they're doing a compliance review to make sure that there's really an equal offering, right? Not one-to-one, but equitable. So that's important to know. It's also important to know that there's some extra nuance with adding sports. And I know that that's the mode that you all are in right now. So there's some nuance around every time that you add or eliminate a sport. So I believe that we'll be having more, or you all with someone will be having more in-depth discussions around that. The athletic director, the Title IX coordinator, there's much to make sure that we're doing right on that front, but I just wanted to call that out. And it doesn't stop there with regard to athletics in Title IX. A somewhat new, I think really important, but I will say somewhat cumbersome requirement, and it takes some thinking about how to best pull it off, is now institutions that offer athletics are required every year to do a disclosure process where every athlete, not just transfer athletes, but every athlete discloses whether they've been found responsible for sexual harassment or some behavior at that level at this or at another institution. There was a problem of folks kind of being found responsible, maybe an athlete being found responsible for some type of sexual misconduct at one institution, transferring, that not being shared or never coming up, and then maybe transferring again. There was a problem with this not being detected. So the NCAA, Department of Education have put it on the institutions to figure out, an annual disclosure, and there are guidelines for that as well. And it's a complex piece as well. So what can you all do as primary individual employee obligations? What can and should you all do as individual employees under Title IX? And here I'm speaking again, I'm speaking to not the Title IX coordinator, not the athletic director, because they have another set of obligations, but a faculty member, a staff member. What do you need to do? How does it intersect with you? And I'll say it's a relatively limited set of responsibilities. It's a relatively limited set of obligations because so much of this buck stops with the Title IX coordinator. So much gets directed there. But for you all, I've said it before, but I would very much familiarize yourself with the VPCC Title IX website, resources and reporting options. List the website address there, webpage address there. I've talked a lot about it, so I won't belabor it, but it's robust and it has information that you need to know. And also, depending on your role, and this goes to the second bullet here, that you may need to educate your folks who report to you and students with which you interact. I think it's incumbent on, I've seen this take root at some institutions where staff and employees kind of say, that's someone else's responsibility. I'm going to kind of leave it there. And I've seen institutions where staff and employees say that is someone else's responsibility, but I'm going to go so far as to really digest this website. I'm really going to understand. I might never be a Title IX investigator. I might never have that direct and intersect. But in my role as a faculty or staff member, I'm going to really make it a point to understand what we have available here, what the procedure looks like, what reporting looks like, so I can pass that on to other folks. And that's kind of a beautiful thing to see culturally, because it ignites a real culture of knowledge around this, just going that far. So I push your people, educate yourself about this, educate others about it through your great resources. Number 3 is the biggest one. I mean, I kind of have hit the ball by saving it until now, but I will tell you, this is the takeaway point. If you don't get anything else from what I said today, know that if you're sitting here, if you're a VPCC employee, you have an obligation to promptly report to the Title IX coordinator any and all sex-based discrimination, including sexual harassment and/or violence. Okay. And that's broad and intentionally so. Because again, I don't want to put any of you all in the position of kind of hemming and hawing and wondering if you wonder, report it. If you wonder, give that over to the Title IX coordinator. If you say, I may be experiencing or I may be witnessing sex discrimination here, or what that person just told me may have an element of sexual harassment or dating violence or domestic violence stalking to it, report. I just want to make it super simple for you. Report. Give it to the Title IX coordinator, get it off your plate, and I'll go to the next. Item here, which is, remember, we're talking about an extremely broad scope here. When we talk about sex, we're not just talking about sex as narrowly defined. There's a bunch of other pieces that come there: orientation, gender identity, those things. When we talk about discrimination, we're not just talking about in the traditional differential treatment sense. There's a lot more that comes into that. Harassment. So if you wonder, report. Get to the Title IX coordinator. You can't go wrong with that, really. And I like to give 2 analogies here, and I'll give a story with this. The financial aid analogy is helpful to me in that I'm not likening financial aid to sex discrimination in any other way other than this. And that's that if you don't work in the financial aid office at your institution, and someone comes to you and says, I need some help sorting through a Pell Grant, or I'm curious about my financial aid balance, or anything related to financial aid, chances, my guess is that you're never going to sit there and try to sort through it with them. That's not your job. It's an easy call, right? You send them to the person designated to do that. You have questions about Pell Grant, I'll send you to the financial aid office. I'd like to impress on you all to take the same approach with regard to anything sex discrimination or harassment related. Think of that. You think of the Pell Grant. I'm not going to try to sort through it. We have someone who is designated for that. Let me get this to that person. Really important. And then the hot potato idea is, I call it a hot potato because here's the import of what I'm saying. Not only is reporting important so that community members can be well taken care of and behaviors can be addressed and eliminated if necessary. Not only is it important for that, but the way that the current regulations are set up, essentially, if one of you all as an employee knows of sex discrimination or harassment, essentially the institution knows. And think about all the obligations that I talked about to address sex discrimination and harassment under very specific grievance procedures and provide specific notices. If you're holding that hot potato, if you think as an employee that you know of sex discrimination or harassment and you're not reporting it, it's a hot potato in truth, because chances are the institution's obligations have been triggered, but you have not given it yet to the person who can discharge those obligations. So you're standing kind of in the middle there. And the biggest Title IX case that I've ever worked on, I've worked on a lot, but this one stood out to me, was the institution ended up with having to pay a multi-million-dollar settlement, and that was their best case scenario. And the reason they had to pay it was because someone held a hot potato. This institution, like you all, had great policies and procedures in place. They really knew what they were doing, but an employee didn't give them a chance to do that. So important to report and do so broadly. And then finally, protect yourself and others, and don't be part of the problem. Certainly, we hope that all the employees we're talking to today would never have a report against them. But important to know what grievance procedures, that there are grievance procedures in place if you did, and to not be part of the problem. Let's see how we're doing with time. Gosh, I talked about that longer than I expected. I'm going to run through this one pretty quickly so we can save some time for Q&A. 5 significant likely changes to anticipate from the new regulations, the ones that we think will be released next year, okay? And this is the part for folks who want a little bit more complex kind of meat on the bones, and they've had the foundational stuff before. Here's what to look for. When we get the new regulations next year, again, not yet, but next year, they are going to re-expand the types of behaviors covered by and the protections afforded by Title IX. So the new regulations will go much further, for example, in providing protections to pregnant students and imposing obligations on you all related to pregnant students. They will enshrine even further sexual orientation and gender identity as parts of the definition of sex, and provide specific requirements related to those. So that whereas the Trump administration sought to narrow the scope of Title IX, we can expect a huge expansion. We can expect some changes to the reporting requirements. And it's not going to be as simple after we get those regulations. We're going to have different categories of employees likely, some of which would report and some of which wouldn't have an obligation to report. As it stands now, we're still telling everyone to report. There's going to be additional grievance procedure flexibility when we get those new regulations. I mentioned the biggest of those, which is the removal of the live hearing requirement. So that's likely no longer going to be a part of how your institution addresses sexual harassment. There's going to be much more ability, and this is a great development. When we get the new regulations next year, there's going to be much more ability and much more guidance around how to resolve sex discrimination situations informally. Okay, so that's always been somewhat of an option, but now we're going to really have an opportunity to not send everything necessarily down the formal process towards a determination. Some things are better handled informally, and that's going to be a much more viable option going forward. And then this last one's important too. Just because the live hearing requirement goes away does not mean that the Title IX coordinator's job is going to get easier. This next round of regulations is actually going to bring a really significant expansion of the Title IX coordinator's responsibilities, with one example of that being this new kind of overlap with athletics, where athletics and the Title IX office have to work together to make sure that the disclosure requirements are being met with athletes every year. Another example of that is the requirements around protections for pregnant students. Look for a really significant expansion of that with the next round of regulations. So let's see. We have 10 minutes left for any questions and discussion. Before we get into that, I'll just recap by kind of recap by hitting again my 2 main points. Familiarize yourself with VPCC's Title IX webpage. If you have questions about it, ask the Title IX coordinator. And internalize now kind of this broad reporting mandate or requirement, internalize the idea of getting anything that's in doubt, erring on the side of caution and getting that to the Title IX coordinator so the institution can discharge its obligations. And with that, I'll stop and see what questions we have. Let's see, I have a chat.
Josh, I can let you know one that came in
Yeah,
to
please.
me. And that was, if you could talk a little bit about the difference between the Obama and Trump live hearing mandates. If there's a simple way to explain that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure I can. So, I mean, what's at issue when you're talking about that is if there's an allegation of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, before there's a finding of responsibility or not for that, before there's a finding of whether there was a policy violation or not, is the institution required to do a live hearing, or can they discharge their obligations by doing something short of a live hearing, like a panel that reviews the evidence and votes on it, or like a single investigator? Well, the simple way to talk about it is that under the Obama administration, there was certainly no live hearing requirement. The Democratic departments of education tend to be hostile to a live hearing requirement. Republican administrations tend to favor a live hearing requirement. At least that's what we've seen through the regulations. So under the Obama administration, there was no live hearing requirement. So when there was an investigation of allegations of sexual misconduct, that ended with one of the models that I mentioned before, either a single investigator model where that person investigated and went ahead and made a decision, or a panel model where they handed it off to some other decision maker that made this decision. In May 2020, Trump administration said, can't do that anymore. If you have Title IX sexual harassment, you must have a live hearing with cross-examination, with the ability to cross-examine between the parties using an advisor. And the idea now is that when we get these new regulations, that will go away as a requirement, but it will remain as a possibility. So schools will now going forward get to pick. Do we want that do we want our process in a live hearing, or do we want to do something short of that? And I'll say it's not an easy call. I mean, I work heavy in this space, and it's not an easy call. There are arguments on both sides of that, and reasonable minds can differ, and different institutions can come, out in different places on that.
That's great. Thank you. And I didn't know did you want to unshare your screen and then?
Sure.
We did have another one that came in. And the question is related to.
Gosh, I don't see stop sharing. Oh, yeah, I see.
Yeah, super. The question is related to the scope of what constitutes harassment.
Yeah.
Particularly maybe focused on what might constitute harassment between faculty, abusive behavior towards students, towards instructors, that kind of thing. But generally, harassing behavior would be helpful.
Yeah. So first, for the purposes of, it's a great question, and I'm going to answer it. Before I answer it, let me say, for the purposes of reporting, don't worry about that piece, right? Because the point on reporting is, if you're wondering if something might be harassment, it's better to give it to the Title IX coordinator and let that decision be made there. But it's a great question, and I'll say this, much like live hearings, there's significant movement around what constitutes sexual harassment between the different administrations. So I'll use as an example, the Obama administration, sexual harassment was basically any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. It was a very, very broad definition, right? Sexual harassment was very, very broad and somewhat amorphous under the Obama administration. The Trump administration constrained that a lot. They said sexual harassment, Title IX sexual harassment, is only certain types of behaviors. And I'll tell you what they are, because they're enumerated. Sexual violence, sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, stalking falls under sexual harassment, okay, as those are defined in your policy and procedures. Also, there's quid pro quo sexual harassment, which is if someone in a position of power is conditioning some benefit on some sexual act or sexual activity, that's quid pro quo. And to get right to your question, the way that they really limited the definition of sexual harassment was to say that hostile environment sexual harassment must be severe and pervasive and objectively offensive, right? If it's going to qualify as sexual harassment. So that becomes a relatively high bar on hostile environment sexual harassment, a higher bar than Title VII for what it's worth by way of comparison, because it's severe and pervasive and objectively offensive. So if there's an allegation of sexual harassment between two faculty members, the Title IX coordinator and team would run that allegation through the current procedures and determine whether it met that standard. That will move under the new regulations. So one of the ways it will move is to make that and there will be an or where there's an and now on that hostile environment, right? So it's not going to be severe and pervasive and objectively offensive. It's going to be a somewhat lower bar for that going forward. So to recap, for reporting purposes, don't ask that question. But for non-reporting purposes, to know what constitutes sexual harassment, it's a great question. And it's something that's very much in flux over time. And when the best source, a much better source than all the rambling I just did, is on your webpage in your Title IX policy and procedure, which again is robust, there's a definition section. And what really matters most of all is not what I said just now, but how the institution defines it, which will track mostly what I just said just now. So anytime you can go to that and know that that's laid out there.
Thank you, Josh. That was my question. And Ada, I'm sorry for jumping in, but I do have my hand up. The reason I was asking that question was because in our faculty forum yesterday, issues of basically classroom management had come up. And there was concerns from faculty that there didn't seem to be a policy or a procedure in place that would enable faculty to have concerns of basically student abuse or mistreatment of faculty or staff addressed. And so I was thinking this probably falls outside of Title IX and falls within the purview of the institutional policies and practices. Would you concur with that?
I think it's you're asking the right question, because you're helping. That's a good segue to a point that I wanted to make. If you report something like this and it's not deemed to be Title IX sexual harassment, to the great point you just made, that doesn't mean the institution is going to turn a blind eye to it and ignore it and not address it. That just means it might be addressed under a different policy or procedure with different definitions, right? So I think it would depend on the level. It would depend on the severity, the pervasiveness, and how objectively offensive at this moment to determine whether it went in the Title IX proceedings or some other grievance procedure. You could imagine student abuse of another student or of a faculty member that rose to that level or that didn't, right?
And so what's really important is that there's sort of a clear delineation of to whom to speak and where to go given certain situations, so that whatever concerns exist can be addressed in an effective and efficient way.
That's a great point. And I would say, as to that, I would say, if it is of a sexual nature, or if it involves any hint of sex discrimination, sex broadly defined, or harassment, as we mentioned before, Title IX coordinator is the person, right? Just by basis of that. And you don't have to have determined that it rises to the level of sexual harassment to take it to the Title IX coordinator, certainly. Just it having those elements in play means that it goes to the Title IX coordinator and then they make that determination. And it may well kick out to someone else. In the same way that if someone brings to you a disability related issue, it goes to your 504 ADA coordinator. Yeah. I see a great comment here that I'll just call out. Someone said, well, I guess maybe everyone can see it, but live hearings can put undue burden on reporters. I mean, it's true that live hearings can put a burden on reporters. Whether it's undue or not is, there's a strong argument
that it has a chilling, that live hearings have a chilling effect. There is. And then you counterbalance that, if you're arguing about live hearing or not, you counterbalance that with what process should you afford to someone who's accused, right? So that's the tension there. But agreed, it generally does have a chilling effect.
Well, I want to jump in and just on behalf of all of us say thank you so much, Josh, for taking this time with us this morning. As I mentioned, we've recorded the session, we'll make it available, and then we also have a lot of resources that are going to be available and made public for everyone. So we're going to end the session now, take a couple minutes break, and we will start back up in the next session in about 5 minutes or so, where we're going to talk about FERPA. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Josh.